approached so rapidly that even while they listened it burst into a deafening confusion of sounds at the street corner. "This must be stopped, quieted," said Mr. Haredale hastily. "We should have foreseen this and provided against it. I will go out to them at once." But before he could reach the door, and before Edward could catch up his hat and follow him, they were again arrested by a loud shriek from above stairs, and the locksmith's wife, bursting in and fairly running into Mr. Haredale's arms, cried out, "She knows it all, dear sir, she knows it all. We broke it out to her by degrees, and she is quite prepared." Having made this communication, and furthermore thanked Heaven with great fervour and heartiness, the good lady, according to the custom of matrons on all occasions of excitement, fainted away directly. They ran to the window, drew up the sash, and looked into the crowded street. Among a dense mob of persons, of whom not one was for an instant still, the locksmith's ruddy face and burly form could be descried, beating about as though he was struggling with a rough sea. Now he was carried back a score of yards, now onward nearly to the door, now back again, now forced against the opposite houses, now against those adjoining his own, now carried up a flight of steps, and greeted by the outstretched hands of 100 men, while the whole tumultuous concourse stretched their throats and cheered with all their might. Though he was really in a fair way to be torn to pieces in the general enthusiasm, the locksmith, nothing discomposed, echoed their shouts till he was as hoarse as they, and in a glow of joy and right good humour waved his hat until the daylight shone between its brim and crown. But in all the bandyings from hand to hand, and strivings to and fro, and sweepings here and there, which, saving that he looked more jolly and more radiant after every struggle, troubled his peace of mind no more than if he had been a straw upon the water's surface, he never once released his firm grasp of an arm, drawn tight through his. He sometimes turned to clap this friend upon the back, or whisper in his ear a word of staunch encouragement, or cheer him with a smile, but his great care was to shield him from the pressure, and force a passage for him to the golden key. Passive and timid, scared, pale, and wondering, and gazing at the throng as if he were newly risen from the dead, and felt himself a ghost among the living, Barnaby, not Barnaby in the spirit, but in flesh and blood, with pulses, sinews, nerves, and beating heart, and strong affections, clung to his stout old friend and followed where he led. And thus, in course of time, they reached the door, held ready for their entrance by no unwilling hands. Then, slipping in, and shutting out the crowd by main force, Gabriel stood between Mr. Haredale and Edward Chester, and Barnaby, rushing up the stairs, fell upon his knees beside his mother's bed. "Such is the blessed end, sir," cried the panting locksmith to Mr. Haredale, "of the best day's work we ever did. The rogues! It's been hard fighting to get away from 'em. I almost thought, once or twice, they'd have been too much for us with their kindness." They had striven all the previous day to rescue Barnaby from his impending fate. Failing in their attempts in the first quarter to which they addressed themselves, they renewed them in another. Failing there likewise, they began afresh at midnight, and made their way, not only to the judge and jury who had tried him, but to men of influence at court, to the young Prince of Wales, and even to the antechamber of the king himself. Successful at last in awakening an interest in his favour, and an inclination to inquire more dispassionately into his case, they had an interview with the minister in his bed so late as 8 o'clock that morning. The result of a searching inquiry, in which they who had known the poor fellow from his childhood did other good service besides bringing it about, was, that between 11 and 12 o'clock a free pardon to Barnaby Rudge was made out and signed, and entrusted to a horse soldier for instant conveyance to the place of execution. This courier reached the spot just as the cart appeared in sight, and Barnaby being carried back to jail, Mr. Haredale, assured that all was safe, had gone straight from Bloomsbury Square to the Golden Key, leaving to Gabriel the grateful task of bringing him home in triumph. "I needn't say," observed the locksmith, when he had shaken hands with all the males in the house, and hugged all the females 45 times at least, "that except among ourselves I didn't want to make a triumph of it, but directly we got into the street we were known, and this hubbub began. Of the two," he added, as he wiped his crimson face, "and after experience of both, I think I'd rather be taken out of my house by a crowd of enemies than escorted home by a mob of friends." It was plain enough, however, that this was mere talk on Gabriel's part, and that the whole proceeding afforded him the keenest delight. For the people continuing to make a great noise without, and to cheer as if their voices were in the freshest order and good for a fortnight, he sent upstairs for Grip, who had come home at his master's back, and had acknowledged the favours of the multitude by drawing blood from every finger that came within his reach; and with the bird upon his arm presented himself at the first floor window, and waved his hat again until it dangled by a shred between his finger and thumb. This demonstration having been received with appropriate shouts, and silence being in some degree restored, he thanked them for their sympathy, and taking the liberty to inform them that there was a sick person in the house, proposed that they should give 3 cheers for King George, 3 more for Old England, and 3 more for Nothing Particular, as a closing ceremony. The crowd assenting, substituted Gabriel Varden for the Nothing Particular, and giving him 1 over for good measure, dispersed in high good humour. What congratulations were exchanged among the inmates of the Golden Key when they were left alone! What an overflowing of joy and happiness there was among them! How incapable it was of expression in Barnaby's own person! And how he went wildly from one to another, until he became so far tranquillized as to stretch himself on the ground beside his mother's couch and fall into a deep sleep, are matters that need not be told; and it is well they happened to be of this class, for they would be very hard to tell, were their narration ever so indispensable. Before leaving this bright picture, it may be well to glance at a dark and very different one, which was presented to only a few eyes that same night. The scene was a churchyard; the time midnight; the persons, Edward Chester, a clergyman, a gravedigger, and the 4 bearers of a homely coffin. They stood about a grave which had been newly dug, and one of the bearers held up a dim lantern, the only light there, which shed its feeble ray upon the book of prayer. He placed it for a moment on the coffin, when he and his companions were about to lower it down. There was no inscription on the lid. The mould fell solemnly upon the last house of this nameless man, and the rattling dust left a dismal echo even in the accustomed ears of those who had borne it to its resting place. The grave was filled in to the top and trodden down. They all left the spot together. "You never saw him living?" asked the clergyman of Edward. "Often, years ago, not knowing him for my brother." "Never since?" "Never. Yesterday he steadily refused to see me. It was urged upon him many times at my desire." "Still he refused? That was hardened and unnatural." "Do you think so?" "I infer that you do not?" "You are right. We hear the world wonder every day at monsters of ingratitude. Did it never occur to you that it often looks for monsters of affection, as though they were things of course?" They had reached the gate by this time, and bidding each other good night, departed on their separate ways. Chapter 79.